The Boon Reef Classic was universally recognised as the biggest and most lethal pod race in the galaxy. However, the race set 32 years before the events on Yavin had more at stake than any others. The gambling that went on behind the scenes was frequent in pod racing, especially on Tatooine, and in this particular race, there was a bet between the Jedi Master Qui-Gon and the Toydarian shop owner Watto. Rather than gambling credits, Qui-Gon bet Queen Amidala's ship against the costs required to repair it. As the odds were heavily against Qui-Gon, Watto gleefully accepted the offer, and the compulsive gambler couldn't help himself when Qui-Gon made another bet. This one waged Anakin Skywalker's pod against the slave boy himself, as Qui-Gon had believed that Anakin was the subject of the prophecy of the Chosen One. As we know, Anakin won the pod race, and Qui-Gon used the winnings from the bet to repair their ship, then leave the planet. But what if Qui-Gon had lost the bet? How would Queen Amidala leave Tatooine? What would happen to Anakin? Our story begins just after Qui-Gon had taken a blood sample from Anakin, and with the help of Obi-Wan, they discovered Anakin had the highest midichlorian count of any Jedi. As Qui-Gon sat on top of the low wall with a comlink held in his hand, he thought about Obi-Wan's question. What was the meaning of this boy having such a high midichlorian count? Could he really be the chosen one of the ancient prophecy? His thoughts soon turned to the upcoming pod race, and now knowing that there was even more to the boy than he had initially thought, Qui-Gon considered the risk of participating in the notoriously lethal race. Anakin would be surrounded by pod racers using underhand tactics, and the innovative fuel atomizer was delicate, so victory was far from guaranteed. After Qui-Gon meditated on these doubts, he decided to not push his luck with a second bet concerning the boy and his freedom. He would try to deal with that later. Before the race began, the Jedi Master tried to calm the boy by assuring him to trust in the Force, but hearing that Anakin had never even finished the race caused his doubts to resurface. The Jedi Master joined the others in a viewing balcony, and finally the race began. The pod racers zoomed beneath the starting arch with enormous speed, and after repairing Sebulba's pre-race sabotage, so did Anakin. The young pod racer swiftly caught up to the other competitors, and by the second lap, he had fought his way to the front. Qui-Gon and the rest of Anakin's supporters watched from their view screens with trepidation, especially when he started to clatter into Sebulba, but when they entered the Laguna Caves, their footage was stopped. Though the crowd thought that it was a failure with the hologlide droids, Qui-Gon sensed Anakin in danger. The Jedi Master moved in a flash to the level of the circuit, and he leapt into one of the spare pod racers to find Anakin. Even the commentary stopped in shock when they saw Qui-Gon, and he rapidly accelerated towards the Laguna Caves. Rather than taking the route of the pod racers, Qui-Gon allowed the Force to be his guide, but as he approached the location where the race coverage was lost, he felt a rumbling beneath him. The Jedi Master instinctively tilted his pod racer higher and called for Anakin. The voice echoed across the caves, but there was no response. Just as Qui-Gon was about to travel further into the cave system, an enormous roar shook the caves, and pieces of rubble were dislodged from the inside. Qui-Gon ignited his lightsaber in response to the roar, and in a flash of green he surged towards the source. A canyon great dragon rose from the surface, and thrashed its spiked tail towards the Jedi Master, but he was paying more attention to its spine. Anakin was riding the small great dragon, as if he was still on his pod racer, and it seemed that he had some kind of control. The young slave waved to Qui-Gon, and the Jedi Master called for Anakin to jump, but Anakin confidently barreled out of the cave with the beast. The great dragon let out another roar when it emerged into the heat and light of the twin suns, but soon there was an even greater roar. Unlike the rumble that Qui-Gon had felt before entering the cave, this was tantamount to a seismic shockwave, and the ripples in the sand showed an outline triple the length of the beast ridden by Anakin. Anakin did not need a warning from Qui-Gon and began his escape through the pod racing circuit, whilst closely pursued by the Jedi. Tusken Raiders increased the difficulty of their escape by firing from the cliff tops, but quickly retreated when they saw the bigger beast. Out of the sand, a greater great dragon had been awoken from its slumber, and its vast stature began to batter the walls of the canyon, as well as any checkpoints on the circuit. Now the bigger dragon was closing in on Anakin and Qui-Gon, and the path of the circuit was guiding them back to this grand arena in Mos Espa, which naturally placed the civilians under threat. Qui-Gon was now insistent that Anakin leap off the canyon great dragon, and the threat of being eaten alive encouraged Anakin to jump. The Jedi cushioned Anakin's jump with the Force, and after they took one last glance at the two dragons now battling each other, Anakin and Qui-Gon returned to Mos Espa. When they returned to the settlement, they discovered that the race had been stopped because of the fatalities, and Anakin was the last pod racer standing. The course officials began the process of ushering the crowd out of their seats, which signalled the definitive end of the Boon Reef pod race, and Qui-Gon started to protest that Anakin was the winner by default. The course officials dismissed any thoughts of a protest, as Anakin had not completed the race in his own pod racer, and Qui-Gon knew Watto had a smug grin without even looking. The Jedi was forced to concede that the pod race didn't have a winner, so he reluctantly trudged back to the garages. When he entered the cleared out area, Watto was waiting with open arms, and his greed was written over his face. Qui-Gon maintained his patience, as he listened to the rapid fluttering of the Toydarian's wings, and he calmly stated that the bet was nullified because the race had been prematurely ended. The Toydarian's wings moved faster until they were a blur, as he did not take too kindly to Qui-Gon's words, but considering he had just saved the life of his slave, he decided to allow Qui-Gon to walk away with his broken J327 Nubian. Though the Jedi hadn't lost the Queen's ship, he was stuck in the same predicament as before, and he returned to the ship to search for a solution. On his return from Mos Espa, the Jedi briefly checked on Anakin and Shmi, and he promised that he would return to try and train Anakin. After leaving the home of Anakin, Qui-Gon returned to the Naboo starship, and with their main plan compromised, he has to think of another. As his eyes stared at the smorgasbord of screens by the controls, without registering its contents, a small flicker appeared on one of the screens. Qui-Gon saw that it was a screen monitoring an exterior sensor array, and Rick Oley beside him gestured for him to investigate. The previously meditating Obi-Wan leapt to his feet to join his master, and together they carefully searched the ship's surroundings. When the two Jedi emerged at the foot of the ramp, a small sandstorm had picked up, so now they were entirely reliant on the Force, and soon detected the objects that had been on the scanners. With their lightsabers ignited, they quickly cut down the incoming objects, which were in fact spy droids. As they examined the remains of the spy droids, they were now searching for their master, and Rick Oley soon identified a speeder heading in their direction. Qui-Gon ordered for his Padawan to protect the Queen, and he prepared himself to fight the assailant by assuming his Form 4 stance. As the speeder emerged from the swirling sands, Qui-Gon immediately sensed something strange about the threat, and as it approached him, he headed back towards the Queen's starship. The Jedi Master was able to dodge the fast-moving speeder bike, and as he suspected, there was no pilot. The ramp of the ship was oddly still open, when Obi-Wan should have closed it, and Qui-Gon knew something was wrong. The Jedi's green lightsaber illuminated the lower deck of the ship, and after searching the forward station, he soon found the bodies of several crew members slumped over in their quarters. He had no time to dwell on these losses though, as he turned to check on the rear of the lower deck, which contained a broken hyperdrive and the Queen's surviving droid. When he entered the droid holder, R2-D2 had been alerted to his presence, and after it worked back into life, he sensed a ripple in the Force. The Jedi reacted on instinct, and in the narrow space, he swung his lightsaber at his attacker who had been hiding in the shadows. An intimidating Zabrak faced Qui-Gon, but in such a confined space, neither could gain an advantage, so the one known as Maul ripped the door to the cargo hold. With the duel in the slightly more open lower deck, Maul delved into a flurry of moves, which Qui-Gon was dodging, and at the same time trying to prevent Maul from damaging more of the ship. The Jedi selflessly took the battle outside, whilst closing the ramp to protect the ship's surviving occupants on the upper deck, and back towards Maul's speeder. As the sandstorm intensified, Maul and Qui-Gon disappeared from view, and Obi-Wan was the first to peer his head out of the window. The Padawan knew his master had deliberately drawn the battle outside to protect the Queen, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity go to waste. Though the ship had sustained damage to its hyperdrive, it was at least capable of travelling over the surface of the planet, and Obi-Wan asked Rick Oley to search for Qui-Gon. But on closer inspection, Maul had damaged the sensor arrays, so the Queen suggested that they should find civilization outside of Mos Espa. Obi-Wan took one last look at where he had last seen his master, and reluctantly agreed that the mission to get the Queen to Coruscant was more important. Whilst the Queen's starship was moved outside of Mos Espa, Qui-Gon and Maul were buried amidst the eye of the storm, and both were focusing on survival rather than battle. After several minutes, the two combatants were separated towards opposing ends of the storm's eye, and they continued moving in opposite directions. Whilst Qui-Gon was stranded in the middle of the desert, Maul had emerged to the outskirts of Mos Espa, where the town was in total chaos. The Zabrak initially stood back and observed, just as he had practiced countless times with his master, but after being denied of one duel with the Jedi, he was itching for battle. The Sith apprentice identified the cause of the destruction, which was the greater Great Dragon that had overwhelmed the Canyon Great Dragon, and it was time to move. Maul scaled the slowly crumbling rooftops with supreme agility, and positioned himself within the attacking radius of the dragon. Such was the focus of the assassin, he could hear the humming of his double-bladed lightsaber over the roar of the beast, but as he was about to mount an attack, a familiar speeder flashed past him. Maul's Bloodfin had also been a victim of the sandstorm, but rather than the Zabrak being at the helm, it was Anakin Skywalker. The young slave had seen the sandstorm from his home, and despite the protests of Shmi, whom had already seen Anakin in enough life-threatening situations for a lifetime, he was concerned about Qui-Gon. After he rushed out of his home, Anakin started to call for Qui-Gon through the incoming storm, but his calls fell upon deaf ears. With a display of bravery and recklessness, Anakin moved further into the storm until his body could not withstand the wind when he heard a noise that reminded him of Watto's junkyard. Anakin quickly rolled to one side and realised he had gone too far, so he ran back towards Mos Espa. As he did so, he was grazed by Maul's bloodfin, which had somehow been collected by the storm. Anakin was fortunate that he didn't sustain any significant injuries, and also that the storm was now starting to subside, so he hid behind a rock to recover. His thoughts turned to Qui-Gon and his own freedom, and he was convinced that if anyone could survive the sandstorm, it would be a Jedi like Qui-Gon. After several moments of respite and calm, Anakin brushed the sand from his clothes when he heard the roar of the greater Krayt dragon. Anakin felt a surge of anger within him, as he knew that this dragon had defeated the Canyon Krayt dragon that he had befriended. The young slave looked at the speeder that had almost run him over, and he was surprised to find that the vehicle was still working. Anakin's instincts as a mechanic and a pilot took over, and though the seat designed for Maul was almost engulfing him, he managed to accelerate and steer the bloodfin towards Mos Espa and the dragon. Maul's surprise at seeing the slave on his speeder was over in a moment, and he pressed several buttons on his wrist-mounted remote to bring it back under his control. Anakin and his speeder hovered and drifted back towards him, and he was tempted to slice his head off for his impudence. However, Maul soon sensed the slave was immensely powerful in the Force. Rather than punishing the slave for taking his speeder, Maul decided to show him what real power was like, and dashed towards the greater Krayt dragon. The Zabrak decided to first target the dragon's mobility, and he jumped down to the roofs of the slave quarters to access its 5 pairs of legs. The dragon howled as Maul combined his training under Sidious with an animalistic and savage hatred, and he surgically tore through the dragon's legs. As the dragon stumbled and thrashed its tail, the Sith held the tail with the Force, then threw his lightsaber in an arc to sever it from the rest of his body. The greater Krayt dragon let out a wounded cry, but Maul showed no mercy, and he capitalized on the dragon's weakness by plunging his lightsaber through its head. The settlement of Mos Espa fell silent after the dragon's remains hit the ground, and Anakin, who had remained near the jewel, now suggested that they should loot the gizzard of the dragon for its pearls. Maul could now sense that Anakin was searching for his freedom, and offered to help him in return for him to be his new apprentice. Anakin thought carefully about Maul's offer, as he was torn between not wanting to leave Shmi behind, and fulfilling one of his dreams of leaving Tatooine and seeing the stars. As the local Hutt-employed enforcement led a formal investigation, and combined with Mos Espa's survivors in rebuilding the settlement, Anakin continued to think about the offer, whilst he joined Maul in the bloodfin to go to Watto's workshop. When they arrived, Anakin was the first to enter the junk shop's remains, and he could hear the fluttering of Watto's wings towards the exterior junkyard. Unknown to the young slave, Maul had deliberately manufactured this moment, and the Zabrak lagged behind Anakin. Maul stood in the doorway separating the shop from the junkyard, and he used the Force to trick Watto into killing an injured Shmi. While she had been protecting herself from the falling rubble, Anakin's cries were nearly as ground-shattering as the fallen dragon, and Maul seized the moment to throw Anakin his lightsaber and take revenge. Anakin caught the weapon and almost buckled under its weight, but Maul started to whisper words of encouragement, and Anakin used his hate he felt for Watto. The Toydarian's eyes widened when Anakin ignited one end of the double-bladed lightsaber, and his eyes would remain wide. Maul's lightsaber protruded through the chest of the Toydarian, and before the lightsaber deactivated, Watto slid to the ground. Anakin looked conflicted whilst deactivating his lightsaber, so Maul reclaimed his weapon, then claimed that he had done well. Not far from where Anakin had slain Watto, Qui-Gon was recovering from the sandstorm, and as he had planned, his distraction through Maul had allowed him to get away. The Jedi knew that the Queen was still on the planet with the broken hyperdrive, and their most likely destination was the wretched Mos Eisley. As his comlink was now out of the range of Obi-Wan's, Qui-Gon decided to ride an EOP to a location within range of a signal. The ride was supposed to be one of patience and serenity for Qui-Gon, but at one point he felt a shockwave in the Force, and it felt like the entirety of Tatooine was crying tears of pain. Qui-Gon nearly fell off of his EOP, and every fibre of his being was begging for him to turn around, but his concern for the mission urged him onwards. As he and his EOP made gradual progress, the initial shock he had felt in the Force was replaced by a colder sensation. The Jedi now regretted his decision to not return to Mos Espa, because he knew that the coldness surrounded Anakin. The Jedi moved until sunset fell on the desert sands, when Qui-Gon finally established contact with Obi-Wan, and the Padawan and the Queen's crew had tried and failed to barter with the shady spacefarers. After the crew returned to collect Qui-Gon, the Maverick Jedi didn't tell the others about his theories surrounding Anakin, and instead focused on the original mission, which was getting the ship off of the planet. Their discussion continued through the night, and in the morning, the group decided that they couldn't repair the starship on Tatooine, but instead they would use tugboats to take them towards Coruscant. With one last look at Tatooine, Qui-Gon entered the J327's Nubian's bottom level with Obi-Wan, whilst the Queen's crew took the upper deck. There the two Jedi exchanged thoughts about what had caused the tremor in the Force, and now Qui-Gon shared his theories about Anakin. They were both concerned about Anakin's unlimited potential being placed in the wrong hands, and Obi-Wan in particular thought that Anakin's age and attachment made him less likely to be a Jedi. Whilst the Queen and the Jedi were headed back to Coruscant, little did they know that the Jedi's worst fears had been realised. Back in Mos Espa, Maul had found a deactivation device in Watto's workshop to free Anakin, and now it was Anakin's turn to fulfill his end of the bargain. Maul had ensured that Anakin had no reason to remain on Tatooine, and together they escaped the clutches of the Hutt enforcement to go to Maul's scimitar. Now the Zabrak faced a greater task than manipulating Anakin, which was to keep his master from knowing about the powerful Force sensitive. The plan from Sidious was to meet on Coruscant after capturing the Queen, but after Amidala had arrived on Coruscant, a move which had been anticipated by Sidious, Maul was moved to Naboo. This was a perfect change of plans for Maul, because it now gave him time to hide Anakin and further his devotion to the ways of the Sith and himself. But knowing Sidious, Maul did not believe that he could hide Anakin's existence indefinitely if Sidious was not aware of him already. When Maul arrived on Naboo, the Sith made his way to the royal palace, and in the throne room, he was able to assert his dominance of the Neimoidians. In a bid to not fail his master again, Maul ordered the Neimoidians to survey every square centimetre of land, so they could intercept the Queen when she landed, but also to eliminate obvious areas where he could hide the increasingly impatient Anakin. The former slave had tasted the dark side in his savage piercing of Watto, and now he wanted more. Maul had told him on the journey to Naboo that he had always been destined for a life greater than that of a slave, and it was the Jedi's abandonment of him which had allowed the dragon into Mos Espa, which then caused Watto to kill Shmi. Anakin's hate for the Jedi was festering and simmering as he waited for his master to complete the dealing with the Neimoidians, and it was as if Maul was deliberately stalling for time. However, Maul was also itching for a fight, and his eyes continued to flicker to the patrols monitoring the sensors, when the reality was that the Jedi were far away. On the world of Coruscant, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had successfully guided the Queen to safety, despite the difficulty of multiple tugboat transits. As the Queen and her crew met with Chancellor Valorum and Senator Palpatine, Qui-Gon stayed back with Obi-Wan, and the Padawan could see his master looking thoughtfully but wistfully at the retreating group. The Jedi Master sensed his Padawan's inquisitive behaviour, and truthfully told him of his concerns regarding the Jedi Council, and what he anticipated their response to be after learning of their encounter on Tatooine. After the two Jedi boarded the Jedi shuttle bus to go to the temple, they took the path to the Jedi Council tower and faced the esteemed members of the Order. Qui-Gon gave a thorough breakdown of the events on Tatooine, and a sample of Anakin's blood, which contained the highest midichlorian count that they had ever seen. The council members turned to each other with murmurs of disapproval, just as Qui-Gon had expected from his often narrow-minded contemporaries. The Jedi Master also told them about the mysterious Zabrak assassin, who he thought was a Sith, and once more the Jedi Council exchanged skeptical looks. Yoda's mind was still on the boy, who Qui-Gon had referred to as the Chosen One, and the Grand Master was wary that Anakin would come in contact with Maul. Though Yoda wanted to try and retrieve the boy to examine him, even if he was most likely too old to be trained, his and the Jedi Council's hands were tied down by the Senate's current Naboo crisis, as well as Tatooine being outside of Republic territory. Qui-Gon looked at the stern faces of the council members, who he knew would not give him any special dispensation to go to Tatooine, and with his hands on his hips, his face was one of disbelief. The Jedi Master pointed to the holographic evidence in the centre of the room, which displayed the reading of Anakin's midichlorian count, and told them that they were making a massive mistake. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan walked out of the chamber, and the older Jedi was debating if he should ignore the council's orders to return to Tatooine, so he decided to ask the Queen. Amidala had just gone against the Senate, with the intent to go to Naboo and save her people, and as she was preparing to leave, Qui-Gon entered her apartment. As one of the select few who had seen through her disguise, the Jedi Master wasted no time in finding her amongst the handmaidens. The Queen was surprised by Qui-Gon's visit, until he explained that he wanted to go to Tatooine to find Anakin. Though she had found Anakin to be slightly odd, she could understand why Qui-Gon wanted to find the boy and free him. However, the Queen could not deviate from the plight of her suffering planet, and Qui-Gon was left with a dilemma. The decision between going to Tatooine or Naboo was solved by his closest ally, which was the will of the Force, and it was guiding him to neither of those locations, but to one of mystery. Qui-Gon therefore joined the Queen, until it was convenient to go to the mystery location, but all of them were unaware that the Sith were ahead of them.